Lady Chatterley's lover. With English, nothing could save him from being the eternal outsider, not even love. Yet, women sometimes fell for him, English women too. He knew just where he was with Clifford. There were two alien dogs which would have liked to snarl at one another, but which smiled instead, perforce. But with a woman, he was not quite so sure. Breakfast was served in the bedrooms. Clifford never appeared before lunch, and the dining room was a little dreary. After coffee, Michael's restless and ill-sitting soul wondered what he should do. It was a fine November day, fine for Rugby, that is. He looked over the melancholy park. My God, what a place! He sent a servant to ask could he be of any service to Lady Chatterley. He thought of driving into Sheffield. The answer came. Would he care to go up to Lady Chatterley's sitting room? Connie had a sitting room on the third floor, the top floor of the central portion of the house. Clifford's rooms were on the ground floor, of course. Michael's was flattered by being asked up to Lady Chatterley's own parlour. He followed blindly after the servant. He never noticed things or had contact with Isis' surroundings. In her room, he did glance vaguely round at the fine German reproductions of Renoir and Cézanne. It's very pleasant up here, he said with his queer smile, as if it hurt him to smile, showing his teeth. You are wise to get up to the top. Yes, I think so, she said. Her room was the only gay, modern one in the house, the only spot in Rugby where her personality was at all revealed. Clifford had never seen it, and she asked very few people up. Now, she and Michaelis sit on opposite sides of the fire and talked. She asked him about himself, his mother and father, his brothers. Other people were always something of a wonder to her, and when her sympathy was awakened, she was quite devoid of class feeling. Michaelis talked frankly about himself, quite frankly, without affectation, simply revealing his bitter, indifferent, stray dog soul, then showing a gleam of revengeful pride in his success. But why are you such a lonely bird? Connie asked him. And again he looked at her with his full, searching hazel look. Some birds are that way, he replied. Then, with a touch of familiar irony, but look here, what about yourself? Aren't you by way of being a lonely bird yourself? Connie, a little startled, thought about it for a few moments, and then she said, Only in a way, not altogether, like you. But I am altogether a lonely bird, he asked, with his queer grin of a smile, as if he had toothache. It was so wry, and his eyes were so perfectly unchanging, melancholy or social, or disillusioned or afraid. Why, she said, a little breathless, as she looked at him. You are, aren't you? She felt a terrible peal come into her from him that made her almost lose her balance. Oh, you're quite right, he said, turning his head away and looking sideways downwards with that strange immobility of an old race that is hardly here in our present day. It was that really made Connie lose her power to see him detached from herself. He looked up at her with a full glance that saw everything, registered everything, at the same time. The infant crying in the night was crying out of his breast to her in a way that affected her very womb. "It's awfully nice of you to think of me," he said, laconically. "Why shouldn't I think of you?" she exclaimed, with hardly breath to utter it. He gave a wry, quick hiss of a laugh. "Oh, in that way. May I hold your hand for a minute?" he asked suddenly, fixing his eyes on her with almost hypnotic power and sending out an appeal that affected her direct in the womb. She stared at him, dazed and transfixed, and he went over and kneeled beside her and took her 2 feet close in his 2 hands and buried his face in her lap, remaining motionless. She was perfectly dim and dazed, looking down in a sort of amazement at the rather tender nape of his neck, feeling his face pressing her thighs. In all her burning dismay, she could not help putting her hand with tenderness and compassion on the defenseless nape of his neck, and he trembled with a deep shudder. Then he looked up at her with that awful appeal in his full, glowing eyes. She was utterly incapable of resisting it. From her breast flowed the answering, immense yearning over him. She must give him anything. Anything. He was a curious and very gentle lover. Very gentle with the woman, trembling uncontrollably, and yet at the same time detached, aware of every sound outside. To her it meant nothing except that she gave herself to him. And at length he ceased to quiver any more, and lay quite still, quite still. Then, with deep, compassionate fingers, she stroked his head that lay on her breast. When he rose, he kissed both her hands, then both her feet in their suede slippers, and in silence went away to the end of the room, where he stood with his back to her. There was silence for some minutes. Then he turned and came to her again as she sat in her old place by the fire. "And now, I suppose you'll hate me," he said, in a quiet, inevitable way. She looked up at him quickly. "Why should I?" she asked. "They mostly do," he said. Then he caught himself up. "I mean, a woman is supposed to." "This is the last moment when I ought to hate you," she said resentfully. I know. It should be so. You're frightfully good to me," he cried miserably. She wondered why he should be miserable. "Won't you sit down again?" she said. He glanced at the door. "Sir Clifford," he said, won't he be?" She paused a moment to consider. "Perhaps," she said, and she looked up at him. "I don't want Clifford to know, not even to suspect. It would hurt him so. But I don't think it's wrong, do you? Wrong? Oh, good God, no. You're only too infinitely good to me. I can hardly bear it." He turned aside and she saw that in another moment he would be sobbing. But we needn't let Clifford know, need we? She pleaded. It would hurt him so. And if he ever never knows, never suspect, it hurts nobody. Me, he said, almost fiercely. He'll know nothing from me. You see if he does. Me? Give myself away? He laughed hollowly, cynically, at such an idea. She watched him in wonder. He said to her, May I kiss your hand, Aridgo? I'll run into Sheffield, I think, and lunch there, if I may, and be back to tea. May I do anything for you? May I be sure you don't hate me, and that you won't? He ended with a desperate note of cynicism. No, I don't hate you, she said. I think you're nice. Ah, he said to her fiercely, I'd rather you said that to me than said you love me. It means such a lot more. Till afternoon, then. I've plenty to think about till then. He kissed her hands humbly and was gone. I don't think I can stand that young man, said Clifford at lunch. Why? Asked Connie. Well, he's such a bounder underneath his veneer, just waiting to bounce us. I think people have been so unkind to him, said Connie. Do you wonder? And do you think he employs his shining hours doing deeds of kindness? I think he has a certain sort of generosity. Towards whom? I don't quite know. Well, naturally you don't. I'm afraid you mistake unscrupulousness for generosity. Connie paused. Did she? It was just possible. Yet, the unscrupulousness of Michael's had a certain fascination for her. He went whole lengths where Clifford only crept a few timid paces. In his way, he had conquered the world, which was what Clifford wanted to do. Ways and means. Were those of Michaelis more despicable than those of Clifford? Was the way the poor outsider had shoved and bounced himself forward in person and by the back doors any worse than Clifford's way of advertising himself into prominence? The bitch goddess. Success was trailed by thousands of gasping dogs with lolling tongues. The one that got her first was the real dog among dogs, if you go by success. So Michaelis could keep his tail up. The queer thing was, he didn't. He came back towards tea time with a large handful of violets and lilies and the same hang-dog expression. Connie wondered sometimes if it were a sort of mask to disarm opposition, because it was almost too fixed. Was he really such a sad dog? His sad dog sort of extinguished self persisted all the evening, though through it Clifford felt the inner effrontery. Connie didn't feel it. Perhaps because it was not directed against women, only against men, and their presumptuousness and assumptions. That indestructible inward effrontery in the meagre fellow was what made men so down on Michaelis. His very presence was an affront to a man of society, cloak it as he might in an assumed good manner. Connie was in love with him, but she managed to sit with her embroidery and let the men talk and not give herself away. As for Michaelis, he was perfect. Exactly the same melancholic, attentive, aloof young fellow of the previous evening. Millions of degrees remote from his host, but melancholy, playing up to them to the required amount and never coming forth to them for a moment. Connie felt he must have forgotten the morning. He had not forgotten, but he knew where he was. In the same old place outside, where the born outsiders are. He didn't take the love-making altogether personally. He knew it would not change him from an ownerless dog, whom everybody begrudges its golden collar, into a comfortable society dog. The final fact being that at the very bottom of his soul, he was an outsider, an antisocial, and he accepted the fact inwardly. No matter how Bond Streetly he was on the outside, his isolation was a necessity to him, just as the appearance of conformity and mixing in with the smart people was also a necessity. But occasionally, love as a comfort, arid soothing, was also a good thing. And he was not ungrateful. You must listen to the next episode, the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. This is Morel Bernard saying bye for now. Bye.